Okay, so we have to do a little work on the Cummins VE injection pump that's on Ethan's truck here. What we have is right in this area where this part right here meets the main body of the injector pump. As you can see with my finger there, it's just dripping fuel non-stop. So when the truck is running, it's just dripping out of there. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull this whole injector pump. There's an O-ring that's in here, and while we have that apart, we're going to go ahead and change the main seal on the main drive shaft that actually drives the pump itself. So we're going to be taking this off here in just a few minutes. Okay, so when me and Ethan was doing this, what we got to do is we had to push in the timing pin. It's the pin that's located here on the very back side of the injector, just about straight down in there. It's just a nylon push pin that Ethan, he barred the engine over with this breaker bar here. Thank you. And while I was pushing in really hard on that pin, and you'll feel it go in really slow. You have to do this really slow. If you don't, if you push it in there, someone's cranking on it too hard, actually break that little nipple off that goes up inside the camshaft gear. Okay, so we've got the pin pushed in. That means we're top dead center, and now we're going to go ahead and here on the injector pump itself, you've got this little locking mechanism right here. And what we're going to do, we're going to take this bolt out, and this little piece here comes out, and then we're going to screw this in. And what that does is that tightens down to the drive shaft that drives this injector pump, and that allows it to be stay locked in place, and that way you don't have to worry about your injector pump moving on you. So back this out, this little piece here comes out, and then tighten that bolt back down. You're good to go until you reinstall your injector pump, and then back your bolt out, put this little shim back in there, and then retighten, and you're good to go. So what we have to do now, we're going to be taking off all the injector lines off the back of the injector pump. But you got 4 of them, 1, 2, 3, 4. All these are going to come off. We've got some brackets here and some throttle cables that we're going to have to take off, spring, and then we'll pull the filler tube off to have access to our injector pump gear, and we'll be pulling it off with a gear puller. And then we've got 2 bolts located, 3 actually, be 1, 2, and then the fun one is on the back side. So there's 3 bolts you take off on this side of the timing cover, and then we'll be able to slide the injector pump out. Alright, so we've got our injector lines loose from the injectors itself. We've got the 2 bolts on top of the intake plate. Those are off, and then Ethan's now taking the injector lines off the back of the injector pump itself. We've got our fill tube off, and now we have access to our injector pump gear. This rides on the rest of your timing gears in the front. And what we're going to do is we're going to zip this nut off. lose that washer, because if it falls down in there, you got to take your whole timing cover off. Okay, so we've got all of our bolts and nuts loose off the injector pump. We've got our nut off of the main gear, it's spun off, and then my gear puller that goes on there. I have lost my bolts that went in here, so I'm gonna have to get some tomorrow. But if you don't have one of these tools, you need to get one. Got this off of Amazon, 19 bucks, well worth it, because the nut that's down in there on the back side of your injector pump, and then your power steering pump is here, is a roll pain to get to. But this slips down in there and goes around the back side of your pump so you can get that nut off of there. And that's a fantastic tool. If you got a Cummins, you got to get one of these, because this sure does make life easier for you. So tomorrow I'll pick up some more bolts from my puller, and we'll be able to pull that. It's ready to come off, and then we'll go through the process of resealing it. So I got the gear puller on there, and I'm going to start turning this. And it's going to go ahead and pull that, pop that gear off of there. And all right, there, and it's off right there. Just finally broke loose there. So anyhow, we got that off. We'll take this gear puller off of here, and then we're going to be pushing on this gear to keep it seated to the back side of this timing cover, because there is a Woodruff key that goes inside that gear that sits on the drive shaft coming out of the VE pump. So we're going to be very careful not to drop that Woodruff key down into the timing cover, or else we got to take this whole timing cover off to get it out. All right, so we just pulled this off the back, and let me show you this key that sits right here. That right there, that key is what you don't want to drop down into your timing cover. So Ethan, he was pushing on that gear to hold it in place, and you just gently wiggle this off the back and make sure you don't drop that thing down in there, and you'll be good. Okay, so once you get your pump off there, something that you need to be aware of is you know, you did set your top dead center by pushing in your pin, your plastic pin, into the back of the cam gear, and then that also sets your pump in place. As you can see where that key is, there's also a little mark on the pump housing itself. That ensures that when your nipple is not broke off of your timing top dead center push pin, and then also when you pull your pump off, you know that you're in time with your engine. Just make sure that this is all locked down with this bolt right here. That locks the shaft from moving, but just in case something changes, you want to make sure that that's all in line when you put your pump back in there, and then push this up onto the gear itself before you tighten it up. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and pull this seal out here. It's going to be your main pump seal. And probably the biggest thing is this aluminum, this is steel. So be very gentle when you're prying against this case housing here, that you don't ruin that sealing surface where this seal goes. So I'm just going to use some screwdrivers and some picks and get in there and try to pull this out. All right, so what we did is this is our seal that came out, and we just used some screwdrivers, and we just popped a hole in it, and then we start prying down. We made sure that we didn't pry on the drive shaft and we didn't pry on the aluminum housing, and then it pops right on out of there. Okay, so on the back side of the pump, you've got this little bracket right here. Okay, take that loose. This is what bolts onto another bracket that supports the back of your pump to your block. All of these here were stripped out. couldn't get them loose. So use some vice grips on it and just grab it and break them loose. And then from there, same here too. We just couldn't get a good bite. These apparently been the first time these have been out. So we broke these loose. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take this nut loose, and we're probably going to stick a screwdriver down in there to hold all of the mechanisms inside this, so when we pull this head part off, everything will kind of stay in place. Okay, so we've popped this head off, and these two springs right here sit right on top. One right there, one right there. And they are loose, so be careful whenever you take this apart. And by holding that screwdriver down to the top through the center hole, it puts pressure on this right here, and that keeps everything in place. Okay, these springs, and there's a shim and a washer, sit right on top of this right there. As you can see where the spring actually rides on that, and there's 3 pieces. Actually, there's 4 pieces within this part right here. And then basically it came off really good. This is the O-ring right here that actually it's real super hard right there. That's what's leaking right down through here on this where the two surfaces come together. So that's what we're after to seal this bottom, this back leak. This was our big culprit. This is where all the fuel was pouring out, and it's due to that O-ring right there. And it's hard as a rock. So we've got a new O-ring for that. So we'll get that and put that back together and put a new O-ring on that. Alright, so this was the part that we was holding down with the screwdriver to keep all of this in place. And went ahead and pulled this out. And as you can see, this is a little hole. That lines up, looks like, with the governor. There's a little pin that goes inside that, so we have to make sure that that goes back in place. But something most likely most important is at the bottom of this right here that sits inside there is this little thing right here. Okay, now take a look at it very closely. It's got a little dirt on it, but if you flip it to the side, you can see that there is a little bit of a rolled edge on this side. Okay, that's nice and flat. That would be the bottom. This side has a slight angle right here on the edge, and I don't know if you can see that in the camera or not, but right in there it has a nice little rolled edge that goes up. So when you put that back together, make sure that that rolled edge goes up, and then the flat side is facing down. So let me take you over here, show you what this looks like on the inside. So this is the little stud that goes into that piece I was just showing over there. That little flat disc sits right here on that shiny spot. So I can see that as we go to put that back in, that's going to be kind of hard to actually keep that without falling off. So we'll check into that, see what we can do to keep that stationary. So once we flip that up and lay that back down in here. Also, this right here is very important. That needs to go in a very specific place as well. So this part, and that disc right there goes right there. And then once you get all that in place, this here moves. This will, while moving this, will allow you to tilt that little stem back, and then that stud right there will actually fall into place where it needs to go. And you should be good to go, and then just set your springs in there, and then everything should go back inside. We've cleaned this up really good on this edge. This is where the O-ring is going to sit. And before we put that O-ring in there, we'll put the new O-ring on. Then we'll grease it up really good, and then we'll make sure that we get that slid down in place. You don't want to cut your O-ring on anything. This isn't the best of edge, but it's about as good as it's going to get. It looks like it's just got some corrosion there, and I don't want to do a lot of sanding on that due to all that dirt and grime is going to fall down in there. So we're going to keep that cavity down there as clean as we can. Alright, so went ahead and loosen these up here. This is what your injector line screws onto. And we're going to pull this apart. I think there's maybe something here we need to replace. Alright, so you've got a spring in there. Tiny little spring. That goes in there. And then got some more parts in here. Alright, you've got, looks like this is going to be a two-piece part here. This goes up, this and this moves within this, and this goes in there just like this. And looks like there's a brass washer down in there. Yep. And there's a brass washer. That's what's going to do all the sealing, looks like, on this. As you tighten this down, that puts pressure here, but also then this seals, and that's part of our kit right here. Looks like this would be that washer right there that goes in that place. So we'll spare you the boring time of taking the rest of those out, but that's one unit there. Okay, so what I've done here is I went ahead and took these out here, and I took a wire wheel to them and got them cleaned up really well. Something to be aware of is what I didn't see is this part right here. Every one of these I took apart, all of this came out just fine until I was wire wheeling it, and then this part right here fell out, and this was my last one that I wire wheeled. So when you take these apart, just look at these items here and make sure that you get all those out before you start wire wheeling this down. I kind of got lucky. I thought maybe this was just in one. I couldn't really tell by looking down in there, and then I took a scribe and I dug down into the rest of the three, and sure enough they was all in there, and they was stuck pretty decent. But just letting you know, because if you do, you could lose that, and then that's going to really, it's not going to let this work properly. So something to look at. So I've got these three on. I'm going to go ahead and I took this one apart just so you guys can see. I went ahead and set my new O-ring on my head. That is the O-ring that leaks on here. Before I put that in, I'm going to put a lot of grease on that so that will slide down on the board just fine. And then my next step is I'm going to go ahead and insert this back in there. And same thing here. This little disc that I showed you earlier, that little disc right there comes out. So we're going to stick a little grease on that to keep that in place. And I'll set this in place. I went ahead and have everything cleaned out in this area, ready to put back together. So just make sure you clean this up really good, get any debris that's off, because your O-ring, once you start putting a head on there and slide that O-ring down in there, you want to put a little bit of grease on this as well. Then that way you won't cut your O-ring when you put that in. Then you got to take it back apart if it leaks. So, and this is how I put them back in the head. What I do is I go ahead and stack everything up on top, even this top washer right there. I get that all in place, and I'll just pick this head up and I'll set the head down on there. Then that way I don't have to worry about a spring or something not sitting there right, or the washer kind of gets cocked upwards. Just a little hint there. And so what I did is I went ahead and put some grease right there in the middle. Remember, this little disc right here is very, very important, that the bevel end goes up inside there. And just push it in place, just like that. We'll wipe a little bit of the grease off so you can see it. The bevel end goes up inside, and I think that what that's for is that if you was to push down on there, with being that bevel end right there, it'll actually kind of find that little slot that it needs to go into a lot easier, in case it does kind of fall out whenever you kind of put it down in there. But that grease in place should take care of it all, hold everything in place. Alright, so I'm getting ready to put this all back together, but just keep in mind your governor. Got this little nipple here, that's going to be going into that disc that I showed earlier. This right here is very important. That has a slot as well, and then this is where that little disc rides, right down here at the bottom. So probably not going to be able to show you everything, but there on the bottom you have a little groove. That's where that all goes in place, and we're just going to kind of guide this down in there and I'll have to drop the camera to get that in place, but there's a little, and I'll have to readjust that, but anyhow, we'll get it back in there. Okay, so I've got this back in there. You just have to, when you set this down in here, put a little pressure right here to hold this governor back for that little nipple to go in place, and then the bottom groove, you have to kind of feel that and let that drop in, and then once everything's in there nice and snug, it looks like that's where it's supposed to be. So something to remember, this is the first time I've ever done this on an injection pump before, so I'm kind of learning as I go as well. Done some research online as well, so I mean there's many other videos out there probably can help you out maybe a little bit better, but thought I'd go ahead and bring you through and take you through the process of what I do and what I've done, so it maybe help somebody out. So next step is I'll be getting ready to install these springs here, these here, and these here. These two springs are going to sit on top of this right here. There's going to be one sitting right here and one sitting right here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some more grease on the back side of this head, and this is where these springs are going to be sitting here, up in here. Put some grease to hold those in place, and then the same thing with this here. I'll put some grease on these, and these will stick hopefully up in that location there. So these, I'll probably have to go ahead and set these springs down inside, and I'll go ahead and do that now so we can see what's going on here. So I'm going to set these right here. There's a little raised lip on that retainer down there that will keep these springs right where they need to be. So those, I should be able to set this right down in here. We'll grease this up, grease the O-ring up, set this in place, and then bolt this up. Alright, so I've got everything greased up, got these greased in place and springs in place. So now I'm going to try to drop this thing down in there. Just remember, your fuel solenoid shut off is on the top as you go around to put that all in place. So very gently drop it down in here, find the middle of the springs. Drop everything down in there, just like that. Kind of line it up a little bit, kind of get it pushed in there. Alright, so what I'm going to do here, I'm going to drop these two bolts in here. We're going to get those started, and what we're going to do is we're going to simultaneously tighten them down, alternate back and forth, and what that's going to help do is it's going to help push this this head down in there. And you just kind of have to work it a little at a time on both sides. You just work that head down in there. Just make sure you put plenty of grease on that O-ring. That way you don't have to worry about hopefully tearing it. And then just kind of step back and look at it. Make sure it's going in there evenly. Until it sits down all the way. You kind of feel the resistance with your screwdriver of when it starts to bind up a little bit, and you just stop. And that's it. We've got it down in place, and we'll put our bracket back on, we'll put the remaining bolts back in place, and then what we'll do, then we'll come back through and tighten these up, and then they'll be ready to go. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is I went ahead and put some duct tape on the ends of these injector lines here going into make sure nothing falls down there and gets debris. So next thing is the cold start advance. There's the O-ring here and also one on the back side. This side here faces the engine block itself. I went ahead and taken these loose here, and you got to really, with some corrosion in there, you got to make sure that you really put a lot of pressure on there. If you can't break them loose, then just maybe set some pair of vice grips on there and get that all taking place. Break it loose before you actually pull it off. Okay. Now I think there is a spring on the back side of this and an O-ring. So if you look online, you're not going to find a VE Pump Reseal kit for a 4BT. So this is a 1990 model. I'm going to hold this with my hand here. I get this off. This engine's a 1990 model, and all I did, which that would be a first gen 6BT. So I just ordered that off of Amazon, and as you can see, looks like got a spring here, a little plunger. Here's the O-ring right here. This is what we're going to be replacing on both sides. Take that out, put a new one in, and bolt it back down. Okay, so here's your timing advance. I don't know what you call it, solenoid, I guess, actuator. Something to remember is right in here is a little disc right here. Make sure you don't lose that. That goes back in place. And here it is off. Okay, so I thought maybe that was on a cold start. It sends power down to that little solenoid actuator. And I thought maybe the actuator actually pushed in on this to advance the timing, but it looks like there's a fuel line that goes to the side of this, screws in right here. So I'm assuming when you energize this, opens, lets fuel go through, and then pushes on that disc, and then in return pushes this over, and then also advances your timing to give you a little bit better start when it's cold. So that's kind of interesting to see. Alright, so what we're getting ready to do now is put on the drive shaft seal, the shaft that actually drives the pump. This seal here is made a little different than the seal that came off of it. It actually has a nice rubber side, and then also it's got the metal like the other one had. The other one was all metal without the rubber. This seal looks like it's built a lot better than actually the original one that came off of there. So on the inside you've got a little lip in there. You can see that. But what we're going to do is we're going to put some grease in there. And what this will help do is help the initial lube, because until we get some diesel fuel up around there, there's actually a little weep hole that actually lubes this seal with diesel fuel. And we're just going to pack that little groove with grease, and that way it has a nice little break-in period before it gets sealed. Most importantly, don't get any grease to the outside of your seal. You want that nice and dry and clean. Actually, I'll take a little brake clean with a little rag, and I'll actually clean that. I've already cleaned my housing where the seal is going to go in there. And what I've done is I've found a deep well socket that is the exact same diameter of that, and that's what I'm going to use to drive that seal onto that shaft. Alright, so what I've done is I went in and pushed my seal on there, greased the shaft up good, so when you do drive the seal on there, it just helps make sure that you have enough grease on there. So here's my socket. I'm going to slip that over the top of that, and basically going to just tap that in place. Make sure it's going. May have to go to one side or the other to kind of get it started. And looks like it's about right there. Yep, so she's all going just fine. Just going to get it tapped down in place. Want it nice and flush. Everything looks good. We should be all set. just like that. You just want to make sure it's nice and flush all the way around. And as you can see there, once again, this might be a little bit better angle for you. There's that little timing mark that your Woodruff key lines up on. That ensures that when you took this off, everything is right where it needs to be. So that's done. And basically, I'm not going to mess with the top cover on this. All this is fine. No leaks up here whatsoever. And the reason I'm going to hold off, I'm going to save my gaskets that I have. And when we put, most likely we're going to put a 3200 governor spring in here. And once we get that and the fuel pin, then we'll have the gaskets to do so. So this here should be ready to go back in the truck, and hopefully things will start. I want to show everybody this too before I put this injector pump back on. We've got the oil sending unit. That's what is hooked up to the Chevrolet gauge cluster in there. But also, just so you know, this little plug right here is actually another oil pressure port as well. If you look back in my video of the startup, I showed you where we had the oil sending unit, but also I had the gauge actually screwed in to this one here. So if you want an auxiliary gauge, not only one for your dash, but also want to plug one in for an actual mechanical gauge, you can use that port to get a 100% accurate reading on what your oil pressure is running. Okay, so I'm going to show you something else while I had the pump off. Something that you can probably look at on your own. There's a cover right here, and I've already took some vice grips here and worked this off. This right here is what you call the power screw, and what I understand is you never want to make any adjustments on this unless the truck is running. And what that does is there's a little shim right here that we're going to have to take a little chisel or a screwdriver and just kind of break that loose right there, so that way we can loosen up this jam nut so we can make some adjustments with the screwdriver here. What I understand is if you go more than 3 turns, it's a runaway engine, and the only way that you can shut down your engine is basically by taking a 2x4 piece of plywood and sticking over the turbo inlet or the inlet to the manifold on your head. So go ahead and take that off. It's a lot easier with it off. Something else that we need to look at is this right here. This right here is your fuel stop screw. It has a small little cover on it as well. We're going to take that off. That way in case we have to make any adjustments. And then on the back side is your idle screw here. It's kind of a pain to get to with it in the truck. So there's a jam nut. I loosened that up. This here was kind of froze in the housing, and I put a pair of vice grips on that, and to break that loose, and then I lubed that up. So if you have to make any adjustments with your idle, especially like maybe when you got your air conditioner on during the summer or something, need to tweak it up just a little bit, that's where you make those adjustments. All right, so we got the injection pump in. We got 3 of those wonderful nuts tightened up, and as you can see, right here is that little mark on the pump housing lines up with a mark on the back of the timing cover. Now right above that, I went ahead and put a black mark. I was doing some research and they're saying to advance your timing about 1/8 of an inch. So I took a tape measure and measured from that line in the back of the timing cover up 1/8, and then I just turned the pump before we tighten it down. They said it helps out a little bit, and we'll give it a try, see what happens. Now Ethan, we went ahead and pulled the timing pin back just to make sure we don't break it, and Ethan is now taking out the jam nut or the jam bolt that actually tightens up the injector shaft so it won't turn while you're working on it. And we're getting ready to put that shim back in place, and then we'll retighten it, and everything will be ready to go ahead and reinstall everything that's going on. Alright, so if you guys ever run into this, this may help you out. So what happened here is this injector line, it'd be actually the return line back into the pump. It's at a weak spot. Cracked, broke. So what I'm going to do is I got a barrel nut. These are actually really handy for either welding something together, kind of like when I did to my brake booster. Same deal. So took a drill bit, drilled it out the same size as this one. We're going to stick that in place. And then did the same thing on this one. Had to drill it out a tad bit bigger. Most importantly, what we're going to do, we're going to braze this together and basically remake that joint there. And then we'll have to tweak it, probably just bend it just a tad bit to get what we need. But if anybody runs into this problem with a return line or injector line, you can do this. Main thing is you just want to make sure it's nice and clean before you braze it up. And get your barrel nut centered right in the middle, so your joint is right in the middle of that barrel nut when you braze it up. You don't have to worry about the braze filling that line up. So maybe this helps somebody.